In December 1975, a 24-year-old Kodak engineer carried a strange-looking contraption into his boss's office in Rochester, New York. The device weighed 8 pounds, looked like a toaster soldered to a cassette recorder, and had taken him a full year to build using spare parts from around the lab. He set it up, aimed it at his boss, pressed a button, and showed him what it had just produced. Not a photograph on paper, not a negative requiring chemicals in a dark room. An image, captured, stored, and displayed electronically in 0.01 seconds, with no film required. His boss studied it for a moment, then he said something that would eventually cost the company $28 billion. He said, "That's cute, but don't tell anyone about it." The engineer's name was Steve Sasson. The device was the world's first digital camera, and the decision made in that office on that afternoon in 1975 set in motion one of the most extraordinary acts of corporate self-destruction in business history. To understand why Kodak buried the future, you have to understand what Kodak was, because what it was made the burial feel not just logical, but inevitable. George Eastman founded the Eastman Kodak Company in Rochester, New York in 1892, but the foundation of what became his empire was laid a decade earlier, when he introduced the first commercial roll film in 1884. Before Eastman, photography was the exclusive domain of professionals. It required heavy glass plates, toxic chemical baths, and technical knowledge that ordinary people neither had nor had time to acquire. Eastman changed all of that with a single product philosophy he expressed in one sentence: "You press the button, we do the rest." He sold a simple box camera preloaded with film, and when the roll was finished, the customer mailed the entire camera to Kodak. Kodak developed the photographs, reloaded the camera with fresh film, and mailed everything back. Photography had become as simple as pressing a button, and Kodak was the company that made it that way. The business model that flowed from this simplicity was one of the most profitable structures in the history of American commerce. The camera was merely the entry point. The real money was in the consumables, the film rolls that every camera required, the chemicals that every darkroom used, the paper that every photograph was printed on. Every photograph taken anywhere in the world required Kodak film. Every Kodak film roll required Kodak chemicals to develop. Every developed image required Kodak paper to print. The company had built, without quite naming it, a razor and blade business model of extraordinary reach, and at a scale that made competition almost impossible. By the mid-20th century, Kodak controlled approximately 90% of the film market and 85% of camera sales in the United States. It employed over 60,000 people in Rochester alone. The city was so intertwined with Kodak's fortunes that it was known informally as Kodak City, a place where 3 generations of families had built their entire professional lives around a single company's payroll. By 1975, the year Steve Sasson built his prototype, Kodak's annual revenue exceeded $4 billion and its market value was climbing toward a peak of approximately $28 billion. The company was not merely profitable, it was the kind of profitable that breeds institutional complacency, the kind where the question, what could go wrong, feels not like prudent planning, but like ingratitude toward a machine that has worked perfectly for nearly a century. Sasson had been given a relatively modest engineering assignment: investigate whether charge-coupled devices, a new type of electronic sensor, could be used to capture images. He pursued it with the rigor of someone who did not know the answer was supposed to be no. Using a CCD sensor from Fairchild Semiconductor, a Motorola digital signal processor, 16 nickel-cadmium batteries, and enough spare components to fill a workshop, he assembled a device that could capture a black and white image at a resolution of 0.01 megapixels, store it on a digital cassette tape, and play it back on a television screen 23 seconds later. The image quality was poor by any photographic standard. The device was too large, too heavy, and too slow to be commercially viable. But the principle it demonstrated was both undeniable and alarming. Photographs could be made without film. When Sasson presented his invention to Kodak's management, the reaction was not hostile. It was something more dangerous than hostility. It was polite, careful, deliberate indifference. Executives acknowledged the technology was interesting. They agreed digital imaging would eventually become significant. They asked Sasson to estimate how long it would take for digital cameras to reach commercial viability and report back. His estimate, produced after detailed analysis, was 15 to 20 years before digital photography could threaten Kodak's film business at scale. Management received this with relief rather than alarm. 15 to 20 years was a long time. The film business would continue generating billions of dollars for at least that long. And by then, surely Kodak would have figured out how to transition. That reasoning was not irrational on its own terms. What made it catastrophic was what followed. The digital camera research would continue, but quietly, without urgency, and without any structural commitment to ensuring that Kodak would lead the market when digital eventually arrived. The project that should have been Kodak's most urgent strategic priority became instead a research curiosity, managed by a small team with limited resources. Sasson kept working. The digital camera kept improving, and Kodak kept selling film to a world that had not yet discovered it was about to stop needing it. Throughout the 1980s, the signals were becoming harder to ignore. Sony introduced the Mavica in 1981, an electronic camera that stored images on a small magnetic disc. The image quality was poor, and the format did not catch on commercially, but the device demonstrated that Japan's electronics industry had identified digital photography as a strategic target. Kodak's own internal research accelerated during this period, producing increasingly capable digital sensors and prototype cameras that circulated within the company's laboratories without ever reaching the market. The gap between what Kodak knew was possible and what it was willing to do about it widened every year, driven by a financial reality that felt inescapable. A dollar invested in film generated reliable, immediate, enormous returns. A dollar invested in digital generated uncertainty, delay, and the terrifying possibility of cannibalizing the business that was paying for everything else. In 1989, a Kodak engineer named Vince Baraba conducted what became one of the most consequential internal analyses in corporate history. He led a $1 million study examining the threat digital technology posed to Kodak's film business. The conclusion was unambiguous. Digital photography would eventually replace film. The transition would likely take 10 to 20 years, and Kodak had a window in which it could position itself to lead the digital market rather than be destroyed by it. The study also identified the central obstacle. The film business was so profitable, and the infrastructure built around it so extensive that any serious investment in digital would require accepting lower margins and cannibalizing products still generating peak returns. The study was presented to senior leadership. It was acknowledged, and then the film business continued operating exactly as before, because the film business was still making more money than anyone could justify walking away from. The 1990s were the decade in which Kodak's window closed. Canon, Nikon, Sony, and Casio were investing aggressively in consumer digital cameras, building supply chains, sensor technology, and brand positioning that would define the market when it finally took off. Kodak launched digital products of its own, the DC-40 consumer digital camera in 1995, a photo CD system designed to bridge film and digital, but these products were positioned as supplements to the film business rather than replacements for it. Every Kodak marketing decision of the 1990s was made with the assumption that film would remain central to photography for the foreseeable future. And that assumption was wrong in a way that became undeniable on a single inflection point. 2000, the year digital camera sales in the United States, crossed 1 million units for the first time. That number doubled in 2001. It doubled again in 2002. By 2003, more digital cameras were sold in the United States than film cameras for the first time in history. The film market, which had been Kodak's entire reason for existing, began its vertical collapse. Film sales that had peaked at approximately $8 billion annually in the late 1990s fell by double-digit percentages every single year through the early 2000s. Kodak's revenue, its profit, and its stock price collapsed with them. The company that had once employed 145,000 people began a series of layoffs so relentless that they became a permanent feature of its identity. 35,000 jobs cut in 1997, another 13,000 in 2004, thousands more each year after that, as management tried to shrink the cost structure of a company built for a market that no longer existed. The company tried to find a new future. Under CEO Antonio Perez, who took the helm in 2005, Kodak made a genuine attempt to pivot toward digital printing and commercial imaging services. It launched a line of inkjet printers designed to compete on ink cost rather than hardware price, reversing the razor and blade model by offering cheap printers and affordable replacement ink. It invested in digital printing technology for commercial applications, and it held a portfolio of digital imaging patents that were genuinely valuable. Approximately 100 patents covering foundational digital photography technology, some of it traceable directly to work done in Kodak's laboratories in the 1970s and 1980s. The company that had buried the digital camera was now trying to survive by selling the intellectual property it had generated while burying it. In 2011, with bankruptcy approaching, Kodak identified those patents as its primary financial lifeline and began negotiations to sell them for $2 to $3 billion. The potential buyers included Apple, Google, and a consortium of technology companies, each of which recognized that Kodak's patent portfolio covered processes fundamental to the digital photography industry, an industry those companies had built largely without compensating the company whose researchers had first mapped the technical territory. The negotiations dragged on for months. Kodak needed the money quickly. The deal did not come together quickly enough. On January 19, 2012, Eastman Kodak Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the Southern District of New York. The cruelest part of the Kodak story is what happened to its nearest competitor. Fujifilm, the Japanese company that had been Kodak's primary rival in the global film market throughout the 1980s and 1990s, faced the exact same crisis, the collapse of film photography, at the exact same time. Fujifilm's film business generated roughly the same proportion of its revenue as Kodak's did. It had the same exposure to digital disruption. It watched the same market evaporate in the same years. And yet, Fujifilm did not go bankrupt. It thrived. By 2012, the year Kodak filed for bankruptcy protection, Fujifilm was worth over $12 billion and reporting healthy profits. The difference was not luck. Fujifilm's leadership recognized in the early 2000s that the film business was terminal and made a deliberate, painful, expensive decision to use the profits it was still generating to fund transformation before those profits disappeared. Fujifilm analyzed what technical capabilities it had developed through decades of film production, expertise in optics, chemical compounds, precision manufacturing, and materials science, and asked which of those capabilities could be applied to industries that were growing rather than dying. The answer led Fujifilm into pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, medical imaging equipment, and LCD optical film for flat-screen televisions. None of these pivots were obvious. All of them required significant investment in new expertise and new markets. But the leadership made the investments because it understood that the alternative was waiting for film to finish dying and having nothing to replace it with. Kodak's leadership understood the same thing intellectually. The Barabbas study of 1989 had made the threat explicit. Internal analyses throughout the 1990s had confirmed it repeatedly. The difference was not awareness. It was the organizational will to act on awareness when acting meant harming the business that was currently paying everyone's salaries. Fujifilm acted, Kodak deliberated, and the market did not wait for Kodak to finish deliberating. The company that had been worth $28 billion at its peak was worth approximately $220 million on the day of filing. A destruction of value so complete that it required a moment to process. A company that had invented the handheld camera, introduced roll film to the world, put photography within reach of ordinary families, captured the defining moments of the 20th century, and employed more than 145,000 people at its height, had been reduced, in the space of roughly a decade, to a rump commercial printing business operating under court protection. Rochester, the city that had spent a century being Kodak's city, was left with empty office buildings, a depleted tax base, and a generation of workers whose specialized skills had no buyers. Steve Sasson retired from Kodak in 2009, 3 years before the bankruptcy. In that same year, he and a colleague received the National Medal of Technology and Innovation from President Barack Obama for the invention of the digital camera, the invention that Kodak's management had told him not to tell anyone about 34 years earlier. In interviews after his retirement, Sasson was careful not to express bitterness. He understood, he said, why the people in that room in 1975 responded the way they did. The film business was making too much money. The risk of disrupting it was too visible. The benefit was too abstract and too distant. They made the decision that the numbers demanded. The numbers were wrong about the future. That is the Kodak story in its painful essence. And it is the most uncomfortable kind of business failure precisely because it cannot be attributed to stupidity or malice. The people who said, "Don't tell anyone," were not fools. They were rational actors, responding to incentives that their enormously successful business had created over nearly a century. The film business rewarded protecting itself and punished anyone who threatened it, because threatening it meant accepting lower returns on capital that was generating the highest returns in the company's history. That decision was made over and over again by intelligent people with good intentions in offices across Rochester for 25 years, until there was no longer a film business worth protecting, and no longer a company capable of building anything to replace it. Every industry alive today has a Steve Sasson working in a lab somewhere, building the device that will make the current business model obsolete. The question is not whether that device will eventually reach the market. It will, if not from inside the threatened company, then from outside it, from a competitor with nothing to lose and no existing business to protect. The question every company faces is whether it will have the courage to be the one that takes that device to market, knowing it means destroying what it has already built. Kodak had that choice in 1975. It chose its present over its future. And 25 years later, the future arrived anyway, just without Kodak in it. Don't tell anyone about it. 4 words, 25 years, $28 billion, gone.